Okay, Jacob, let's take a look at this guy. So first I'm going to describe a couple of things instead of just jump into the drawing. A couple of things to consider with any drawing is that everything you've heard about how to draw and art is probably mostly superstition. When approaching a drawing or when getting into any type of artwork, there is going to be much more humbug than there is factual information coming your way. This part of it is actually flim-flam, part of it's fraud and hoaxes. Part of it is it's difficult to understand what art is, so a lot of superstition and mysterious, um, nearly psychic powers are described with it. It's very tangled and unclear in popular description quite a bit. So what I want to do first is I want to go over a couple of ideas and step away from the superstition a bit, kind of focus attention some, give over an order of operations and how to approach a drawing, and give over an idea of what a drawing is. Where it showed up that there were descriptions of going and drawing from a live model, that it is a good idea to, when you get a chance, draw from live models. But if you're not approaching the idea of a drawing properly, it won't matter if you are approaching the subject via models, or you're trying to do it from imagination or any other resource. References, when you use them, are meant to be a temporary thing. You're supposed to get past them. They don't have undirected answers in them. There's formats that you have to consider and things that you're supposed to ballistically aim your attention at certain things and look for certain parts and how to and actually navigate and analyze quite a bit. How to do that isn't just a question of feel. It actually has real solid logic behind it. I know that it's not a very popular idea to be unromantic about art, but I am extremely unromantic about art. And, I hear terms like mathematical and cold and all that. There is nothing more mathematically calculated, nothing more precise than what we're doing. It isn't a touchy-feely thing in the sense it's mystical. Feeling, in other words, how we feel about a drawing, what we perceive via the vague idea of feeling, is a real part of it. It is an actual thing that we have to consider, but it isn't mysterious. That idea of feeling involved with drawing has real neural meaning. It has to do with how our brains interpret external information and how we project agency into those things. So these are real concerns and real aspects of any type of drawing or piece of artwork we have to address. So when dealing with like books of reference or how-to books, a couple of things have to be kept in mind. One is they aren't recipes. Per artist, they're going into a set of ideas as to how they've arrived at different conclusions. It isn't really a thorough or precise guide. No book yet has come out that is a very thorough step-by-step guide. And this is because art is lacking in conventions. You'll hear people talk about principles, learning the principles, but when you start honing in on those principles and trying to find out what they are from any particular artist, things start to get very vague, and the word principle is used superstitiously, and this happens quite a bit. When you take two steps in, advice from instructors or other people will start to fail very quickly. So one of the things I want to cover is first what it is we are doing when we're making a drawing. When most people start drawing and when they get into drawings, what they're doing is not what the tools of drawing are aimed at making. What people are generally trying to do is draw a drawing. In other words, they have a notion, they have a category of ideas, they have an expectation of a type of product that they normally expect, and they want to try to make that product, like making a homemade version of something famous. But that's not what a drawing is, and it's not what drawings do. Drawings are, in a simple way, we can look at it and say drawings are a two-tiered toolkit. The first part is the drawing utensil and the drawing surface, whatever we happen to be taking and applying two-dimensional rules to create an illusion of three dimensions. And what that describes is our second toolkit, which is a cognitive toolkit. By using line and contrast and value, we are engaging people's hierarchy of the visual cortex, a functional hierarchy that builds how we see, that builds how we experience vision. It isn't entirely visual. Part of it has to do with our body schema and how we personally perceive space. So what we're doing with lines and curves and corners and shading and all these things is we're trying to engage an experience. We're trying to trick people's brains into understanding what this two-dimensional illusion is as if it's a reality of sorts. Brains, of course, aren't so easily tricked that they're just going to swallow it up without noting that it is a drawing, for example. But they do take in the information, subtle information and pre-conscious information, like when you draw someone's mood or if you draw postures, people will be able to tell you history. Even though they go, that's just a drawing, they'll say something. He's very angry. That drawing, even if it's cartoony, is very angry. So we're taking our material tools and we're then turning those into cognitive tools to take the knobs and sliders of people's cognition and manipulate it. In order for us to do that, we have to understand what it is we're making and the processes in how to get to that outcome, how to create these illusions and these hyper-real experiences. So a couple of things to consider with a drawing at first, especially a drawing of a person, is what is a head, for example, in the drawing that you've done here. What is a head? We can think we know, we can try to understand, well, it's got an eyes, nose, mouth, and so on. But that's far too general a way of considering. So let's break it into some separate parts. And the separate parts we'll start with is what is a head shaped like? Why does it have the shapes and contours that it does? When we look at it, what is it we're looking at? So we're not actually going to be looking at and considering a face in just the idea of the object a face or the object a head. We're going to start looking at the components, the separate individual parts, each piece discretely, and then the parts that make up those parts. So we're going to consider that before we take any steps of making the drawing. We have to build our knowledge before we set pencil to paper. And then there's a way that we'll address setting pencil to paper, or whatever tools you choose to use. We're going to fill in the gaps of what we don't know, where we have an illusion of knowledge, and try to then make a one-to-one comparison. We're going to make a one-to-one accounting of what the face has, what it's missing, what might or might not be wrong, and so on. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the this skull. So this skull comes from 3D Scan Store, and it's part of the Ecorche group. So I'm going to grab this so we can just look at this, and we'll set it very similarly to the composition of your picture. And let's look at it a little bit. Oh, great. We'll adjust it so it can sit side by side. Now, when we look at this face, there's some things that we have to consider. Like one, we know there's eye sockets and eyes fit in here, and this is a conspicuous feature. We're going to look at this very closely in just a moment to try to figure out what it is we need to draw and where the drawing that you've made has the appropriate parts, but they might not be the appropriate angles. They might not be accounting for the entirety of the structure, or even how things tend toward what is behind. So like if we look at the eye socket here. So if we look at the eye socket that you've made and the cheek that you've made, the first thing I'll point out is that there is a tendency, and this isn't necessarily wrong because there's a way to manipulate this further on in the process of learning to draw, but the eyes are at a different angle of facing the viewer than the side of the head is, than the shape of the head is. And the same with the mouth. Basically what's happened is that the mouth here is very nearly the same curvature as if it's face front and just cut off on the side. That isn't a criticism, and we'll go over how to fix that and how to truncate it and what it means to start delving into amodal completion, which is our expectation and understanding of things no longer visible but still having an existence, and how we can make those things fall off into a distance and so on. So the parts that we can look at immediately are, there seems to be a missing cheekbone, which is an extrusion, a protuberance. So let's get a little closer here. And let's look at what exactly an eye socket is. Let's look at this whole structure and kind of become familiar with this thing. Now there's a site called Bone Clones, or there's a company called Bone Clones, and you can actually order a skull if you ever get the opportunity to do so. I think it's an acrylic resin skull, and it works just fine to give over real dimensionality, so you can manipulate it and play with it and stick your fingers in sockets and get a feeling of textures and whatnot. If you don't want to do that, and 3D Scan Store has skulls like this in an Ecorche kit, so you can start looking around in an object if you've got these 3D programs. If not, you can get the kit and like bring an OBJ into Blender or whatever software might be available, to even Photoshop, to look at and manipulate an object like this. So what we're going to want to do is first take an overview of the skull and identify parts. So eye sockets, obviously, they're not especially circular. They tend to be somewhat squared, rounded squares when seen face front, but they've got a real depth. They're oddly shaped things. Okay. Depending on profile or face front, they have a dramatic difference in look. As much as the idea when first coming at this might be that you want to see it, or even think of eyes, what we're actually going to be dealing with is the terrain and the extrusions of the face to help guide us in what it is we want to see and what it is we're trying to draw. So if you notice here, at a 3/4 view, there's a curvature right here on the eye socket. This curvature when the skull is slightly turned, starts to fade and fade off into the outer rim of the eye socket and into the zygomatic arch and cheekbone. Okay. Now this is important because the angle here, these types of angles are fairly dramatic but telling differences, and they can be used as a shorthand. Like if we go and we look at your image, if we were to take and just say, okay, this is the 3/4 view, I know a 3/4 view has two curves at these angles. We can actually start to shorthand and give ourselves a couple of topological guides and maps to go, well, I do know that at this angle, I'm not seeing the full rounding, I'm not seeing the full plate of the cheekbone as it goes into the eye socket. So when somebody's a 3/4, I can think of two C's, a dramatic C and a minor C. And these are just simple guidelines. They're guidelines to start. Very soon in, you drop these. You won't think of it in terms like this. But these are just ways of starting to approach and correct where your drawing might be going wrong. Okay. Likewise, where the cheekbone comes out here and dramatically falls in here, there's almost a placement for that here, but the mouth then isn't placed correctly. And I'll show you where we can actually start to draw lines and say, well, if the brow is here or mid-eye is like right here, I know that the mouth will be here. If mid-eye is over here on this, I've lost the outer edge of the mouth. Okay, so let's take a look at this a little bit more and start and gain some familiarity. These crevices here are where muscle attachments are, so most of the facial expressions are going to be in this area. These areas right here have all of your cheek motion in them, your cheek and mouth motion. Here's where your eye motion is, except for the eyeball. Here's jaw chewing. Any divots and concavities in the face, on the surface of the face, those are muscle insertions and large activity areas. So you know that this is almost a wall of activity. Major masses will be moving here as opposed to right here, where there's going to be possibly finer line work or extrusion of bone along here, let's say, right next to the ear. We'll see the cheekbone. If you are doing animation, this area will signal quite a bit of activity. All right. So let's take a look at a couple of other angles. Underneath, how far things go. So placement of the tip of the nose, for example, of the bony tip of the nose. So like right here, as we look at that, we can start to, if we incrementally turn this head, we can start to see how much space it takes up. Where this large protuberance of the brow, where it falls off, and it doesn't fall off in a straight line, it angles down. So we can see that it actually is coming in at quite a dramatic angle, not across. Oftentimes people will make the mistake of drawing 3/4 views and even eyebrows, the mass of the eyebrows as a straight across, because we tend to be focused on the hair of the brow. But what we want to do is make the mass one thing and the hair of the brow another thing. They have at times contradictory angles. So just looking at that, this is just an idea of how to start approaching it. Not really looking at the skull as a one-by-one snapshot, but actually manipulating it and saying, well, okay, if I'm drawing a profile, where is this guy? Where is this thing? In my drawing, if I were to draw over this, where is this guy? Am I making sure that I have accommodations for the eye socket, for the bony mass of the eye socket. Is there a part of my drawing that in highlight, in value, has indicated that it's changed, that it's an existing object? Okay. I hope that gives over the idea of how to start addressing the architecture. Okay, and this is what we're looking at here. So the first pass is looking at what is the skull, what is its architecture, what is it we're drawing, what pieces have to be accounted for, like eye sockets, bones of the nose, bones of the jaw, the outer jaw, the tip of the jaw, what isn't the jaw taken care of, like right here, we'd need a mass of muscle. We'd need the various jaw muscles that they have to be accounted for, and they exist and they have angles. So this architecture has to be considered. The next part of the drawing, once we have a better understanding of the architecture, is how is light striking that architecture? If we think of the architecture as having functional structure, but it also has form and space, how is light striking that? And going by Scott Robertson, he has an art course and an art book on rendering, and he has the phrase form change equals value change. The next part we'd want to consider is, where is light coming from, and how is light decaying and or not being cast on the object we're looking at, on the architecture we're looking at. Okay, so with those parts said, what I'm going to do next is, I'm not going to talk very much. What I'm going to do is, I'm first going to take your drawing and I'm going to adjust the architecture. And then once the architecture is adjusted, I'm going to set some frameworks where I'm going to prepare to handle the form and value, the form change, and as described by value, basically shadow and light. Okay, so I'll proceed from there, and I'll stop talking. Okay.